Okay, so the topic that we're now talking about is I've called neoclassical utilitarianism, and there's two parts to this discussion. One is John Stuart Mill, who we're going to start talking about, and his harm principle. And the next topic is neoclassical economics. They both belong to the same school, general school of thought. Okay, so let's start with Mill. Here he is, and obviously an early photograph, early in the sense that it was early in the days of photography that it was taken. Okay, now Mill wrote a number of very famous and important works, but for our purposes, two very important pieces, essays. One essay called Utilitarianism and the other essay called On Liberty. The first essay, the Utilitarianism essay, is very much in the tradition that we've been looking at. It's taking Bentham's ideas and developing them. So that's a theory about utilitarianism. And the second essay does something a little bit different. It tries to reconcile utilitarianism and liberalism. So this essay on liberty, hence its name, On Liberty, is about reconciling utilitarianism and liberalism. See, on the face of it, there's no obvious connection between utilitarianism and liberalism. In fact, as we saw, at least in his early days, Bentham was quite happy with the idea that the British aristocracy would continue to govern Britain, and he wasn't a supporter of democracy in our sense in the beginning. He changed his mind about that later, but only because of his disillusionment with the British aristocracy. Okay, so in Bentham's view, there was no essential connection between freedom and between utility and democracy in any case. But Mill wants to argue that there is an essential connection between liberty and utility. So he wants to say that if you are a utilitarian, you have to also be a liberal. That's Mill's position. And that's why the essay is called On Liberty. Now, in the textbook, Ian Shapiro says that according to Mill, freedom is intrinsically valuable. Okay, and I think that that's actually not right, and I need to just explain why I think it's not right. Now, first of all, we have to be clear what it means to say that something is intrinsically valuable. So the distinction here is between things that are intrinsically valuable and things that are extrinsically valuable. Things that are intrinsically valuable are valuable for their own sake, and things that are extrinsically valuable are things that are valuable for not in their own sake, but for what you can get with them. The classic example of something that is extrinsically valuable is money. So money has no value in itself. It's only valuable for what you can get with it. So money is extrinsically valuable. Whereas for Bentham, pleasure was intrinsically valuable. Okay, so pleasure was valuable for its own sake. Now, for Bentham, something like, say, friendship is valuable, but Bentham would say that friendship is only extrinsically valuable. It's valuable because it brings pleasure. For Bentham, pleasure is the only thing that's intrinsically valuable. Okay, other things are extrinsically valuable. So friendship for Bentham is valuable, but only because it brings pleasure. So it's like money. It's extrinsically valuable, valuable because it brings pleasure. Okay, so the question is, what status does freedom have in Mill's theory? According to Shapiro, Mill thinks that freedom is intrinsically valuable. So freedom is valuable for its own sake. I don't think, now that's possible. Maybe Shapiro's right about that, but my own view is that that's not Mill's position. Mill's position is that freedom is only extrinsically valuable. It's only valuable because of and to the extent to which it produces happiness. But there are two other things. First of all, I think that Mill thinks that freedom is a necessary condition for happiness. So for human beings at any rate, if you don't have freedom, then you won't be happy. Right? It's necessary. Freedom is necessary for happiness. Okay, freedom's still only extrinsically valuable, but you need it in order to get happiness. And the second thing is that freedom conduces to happiness. So if you have freedom, that fact alone is likely to make you happy. Okay, so we might summarize my position by saying that if I'm right, according to Mill, freedom is a concomitant of happiness. You need it in order to be happy, and freedom brings happiness, but happiness is the only thing that's intrinsically valuable. Shapiro might be right, I might be right. Anyway, there are two views. Now, in any case, it's clear that Mill thinks there is a very tight connection between freedom and happiness. Why might there be such a tight connection between freedom and happiness? And Mill has a number of answers. His first answer is that, and compare this again with Bentham, Mill thinks that people are the best judges of their own self-interest. Now, he's not saying that people are perfect judges of their own self-interest, but he's saying that, generally speaking, by and large, individuals are the best judges of what makes them happy. Okay, now, again, so that's not what Bentham thought. Bentham thought that experts could do a better job of this than individuals themselves, and Mill just thinks that's wrong. Maybe in some circumstances, experts will do a better job, but basically, individuals are the best judges of their own self-interest. Okay, now, fallibilism, the idea that we can be wrong about stuff, fallibilism is a theme that really runs through Mill's philosophy. And it's kind of interesting, this generational difference. I mean, Mill's sort of the next generation of philosophers on from Bentham. And Bentham had this kind of idea that science would bring certainty. And that idea faded to the idea that what science would provide was not absolute certainty that scientific theories, they'd be there, they're established, and they'd never be challenged. Mill lived in an era where people had a different view about science. It's a view that we still have today, and that is that science provides theories about things, but those theories are always fallible, in the sense that even our most well-established scientific theories are always subject to revision. We could discover that there isn't, it's possible, it's hard to imagine, but we could discover that the theory of universal gravitation is false, right? We're open to that possibility. We're fallibilistic in this sense. We recognize that even our most deeply held, cherished beliefs could be wrong. Okay, so Mill is not saying that we are infallible judges of our own self-interest. He's just saying that there's nobody better, right? There is no one who is an expert in our own self-interest in that sense, right? We're the best judges. We may get things wrong even quite a lot, but there's nobody better than we are. So that's the first reason, right? Well, there's a connection between liberty and happiness. We're the best judges of our own self-interest. Another reason that Mill gives, and this is an argument that he gets from Aristotle, he says that for human beings, self-realization is essential to happiness. Self-realization. I have to make myself into a certain kind of person. I have to realize myself, and I need the freedom to do that. Someone else could make me into something, and let's say that maybe this is something coming in the not too distant future. When you're 17 years old or something, you'll get people come around to your house and they'll conduct some sort of personal profiling on you and work out what your ideal career is and so forth, and then they'll instruct you on how you're to prepare yourself for the workforce and what your university training should be, if that's, or whatever kind of training it is that you need to undertake, and they put you in the right position. It's all designed to make you happy. Mill says, yeah, but you won't be happy if someone does this for you, because self-realization is an important part of human happiness. You have to make your own decisions, right, in order to be happy. And yes, you'll make mistakes along the way, but that's part of leading a happy, fulfilled life. So self-realization is very important. That's the second connection between freedom and happiness. We need to be, human beings at any rate, need to be self-realized in order to be happy. We're not like dogs or you can just train a dog to be happy. Train a dog to behave in a certain way that will make the dog happy. But you can't. Well, I haven't had much luck doing that with my dog. But anyway, in general you can, but you can't do that with human beings, because human beings have to self-realize in order to be happy, Mill thought. The third connection between freedom and happiness is that Mill thought it was important that we make mistakes, because error illuminates truth. We learn about what's true by observing what's not true, right? I learn about myself. I learn about what works for me by making mistakes and figuring out what doesn't work for me, right? And that's very important, right, Mill says. Okay, and he talks about this in the context, for example, of freedom of expression. He talks about what we now call the marketplace of ideas. But the idea is we don't want out there people only saying what's true. It's important that people out there sometimes say what's false, because in its conflict, in the conflict between truth and falsity, truth, as Mill puts it, will shine out. Right? The existence of falsity makes truth appear to us more alive and real. Error makes truth shine out. And this is an idea that Mill clearly gets from science, because the idea is that what we don't want in science is to sort of have established theories that nobody's allowed to question, because, as I said a moment ago, we recognize that even our most deeply held scientific views may turn out to be false. That's the fallibilism that's very important to scientific development. We don't want things to be just established as fact, because they might turn out to be false. So it's very important that we adopt this fallibilism and recognize that even our most deeply cherished views may be false. And Mill just thinks that's got to be true about our ideas about morality and justice too. Right? We might very deeply hold views that may turn out to be false. And think about this in certain contexts. So, for example, Plato and Aristotle, very deep, important moral thinkers, but never thought there was anything really wrong with slavery. Well, they had a little bit of trouble with slavery, actually, but they just didn't see that there was anything wrong with it. Right? Well, we don't feel the same way anymore, because we've come to question that idea. And just think, but there were people living in the south of the United States not very long ago, right, who really felt deeply strongly, very deeply, very strongly, that morality required the oppression of black people. Right? And it wasn't just that they didn't, they thought that morality allowed them to do it. They thought morality required it, right? So it's very important, says Mill, to recognize that even our very deeply held views should be open to challenge from others. Now, I think we've really rather lost this idea today. We live in a world in which we do think that there are certain, at least a lot of people do think, that there are certain views that we just have to accept, or at least that there are certain views that you are not allowed to express. And I know that if Mill were alive today, he would find that deeply worrying. Mill was very worried about the level of conformity that existed in the Victorian society in which he lived. And I think he'd be very worried about the level of conformity in the society in which we today live. I think we live in an increasingly conformist society. And one might think of it in various contexts in which I notice it. So just to take one relatively harmless one, that, at least on the face of it harmless, that I'm going to talk about again later in the course, is just the way people at university dress and behave. This has completely changed since I was a student. When I was a student, basically, what can I say? You can't really see that, you only see my top, but I wear the same clothes now as I used to wear as a university student. But lots of people didn't. Lots of people wore clothes completely different to this. People would, when I was a university student, there were lots of people who were punks, and they would, wear punk clothes, and they would have, mohawks, and then there were heavy metalers who wore heavy metal clothes and had long hair, and then you had people who just wore bizarre stuff. So there was one guy who used to wear a green suit with a big top hat, like a leprechaun, but he was actually really tall. And people would just wear these clothes, bizarre clothes. People came to university in part to sort of experiment with who they were and to not conform. Whereas now, when I teach at uni, of course I'm not doing it this year because I'm here in front of a camera, but when I teach at university, everyone basically wears the same clothes that I do. Everyone's hair is basically the same hair, right? They're all conventional haircuts. No one's wearing anything weird. No one wears strange makeup. No one's done anything odd. Right? No one has people don't even really have strange piercings. I suppose the thing is now is tattoos, but then everyone gets tattoos, right? It's the new conformity. I'm not having to go at anyone who has tattoos, but I think you can see what I mean. There are certain ways that you behave, and university used to be a place where the normal social rules didn't apply, but they do apply now. I mean, I walk around campus, and back in the days when that was legal, I'd walk around campus and people are all wearing the same clothes, looking the same. That's really noticeable change in my lifetime. Another example has to do with the expression of opinion, particularly of unpopular opinion. I think it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to express unpopular opinions. And a really clear example of that would be the Israel Folau saga. For those who don't know, Israel Folau was a rugby player, an Australian rugby player, who made some comments about a number of people, but including homosexuals. The idea was if homosexuals don't repent, they'll go to hell. This was the claim, amongst a whole lot of other people, adulterers, drunks, and so forth. And he was making this from a particular religious viewpoint. I'm sure you're familiar with that viewpoint, even if you're not aware of the details of this particular case. And anyway, now a bunch of things happened to him. As a result, he lost his contract with Rugby Australia and wasn't able to play rugby anymore. At the moment, he's playing rugby league in France, I think. Anyway, I don't want to comment on his sacking from Rugby Australia. I think that that was a very difficult situation that they found themselves in, actually, and I don't have time to comment on all the ins and outs here. I just want to comment about the public reaction to Folau's comments about homosexuals. One of the things that was really noticeable about the response is there weren't many people who said, Israel, I disagree with you. Here's why I disagree with you. Let's sit down and talk about this. I'll explain why I think you're wrong. And what's more, I'll explain why I think you shouldn't make these comments because they're harmful, they hurt people. Let me explain this to you. There was not a lot of that went on. There was a lot of, you're not allowed to say that went on. You can't say that. These things are banned, right? Now, of course, they're not legally banned. It's not illegal to say these things, but that was, I think, the response of a lot of people. You must not say that, right? Now, we might think about whether that kind of response is the kind of response that a healthy society would really make. Mill's view is that wouldn't be the kind of response a healthy society would make. A healthy society might actually respond to comments of that kind by a rugby player by ignoring them, right? It might just say, well, who cares what a rugby player thinks about these issues? I mean, why should we care? A healthy society might also try and reason about this, discuss, right? And Mill's view is that the truth would, as he puts it, shine more clearly in the light of that discussion. Whereas just trying to bury views that we disagree with is a destructive way of dealing with these problems. So Mill, I think, would say that we live in an increasingly conformist society, and that's something that we ought to be worried about. And on this conformity, we might notice that the conformity goes both ways. So that is, there's, as we might say, political correctness from the right and from the left. So just to take a couple of examples of that I think are interesting. An example that I've talked about for many years, and that, you know, the students who I teach it to, with the sort of typical political views that they hold, they like this example, would be this band in the United States called the Dixie Chicks. When the United States invaded Iraq during the Second Gulf War, they made some statements, anti-war statements, and they are a sort of a country band, and so their audience is, you know, generally speaking, quite conservative, and the backlash against them, the backlash against the Dixie Chicks for making these anti-war statements was huge. It was basically got to the point where they weren't selling any more of their records, and they weren't able to perform anywhere, and they kind of, you know, if I could put it this way, they had to grovel, all right, to be accepted back into a country in Western society. They had to publicly apologize and so on. So the idea is that, I mean, they're just a bunch of musicians, right? You might think, well, who cares what they think about the war? But that's not the position that people took in the United States. The position, at least in that subsection of US society, the position was, you're not allowed to be anti-war, right? That's not allowed. Like, it's not illegal to be anti-war, but you can't actually operate in society in the way in which you want to operate, you were operating, if you express anti-war sentiments. Okay, so that's an example of where social pressure from the right is applied in a way that Mill would think was inappropriate. Now, let me give you another example, which you know, my students with their general political background would not be so comfortable with, and that would be when the current Prime Minister of New Zealand became Prime Minister. There was a lot of debate. She's a woman, and there was a lot, and she fell pregnant and has had a child, and there was debate in New Zealand about whether it was appropriate for a Prime Minister to have a child while serving as Prime Minister. Now, again, a lot of the response to that kind of questioning was to say, you're not allowed to ask that kind of question. It's just sexist, it's out, it's not permitted, right? And again, we might think, is that really the kind of response that we want to make as a society, to shout people down, right, who are raising these questions? What actually happened in New Zealand, as I think is quite interesting, is that there was eventually some debate about whether it was okay for a woman to have a baby while being Prime Minister. And the general consensus has been, yeah, it's fine. And because she had a baby, and that seemed to work out all right. I guess she's not seeing much of her child at the moment, which is no doubt a problem for both her and the child and her husband. But I mean, that's of course their own business. I'm not meaning to comment on that. I just feel for them personally. But as a result of the debate that occurred, I think that it may well be the case that the position of women in general in society has been improved, right? So even if I'm trying to get you to see Mill's side of the argument here. Mill would say, look, even if you do think that questioning whether Ardern should have had a child while serving in office, even if you think that question was totally sexist, it was better to get it out in the open and have a debate in society, because as a result, the position of women in society has been improved, right? These heretofore buried, maybe unconscious, maybe unspoken sexist views were aired in the public, subject to criticism, and as a result, we've moved on as a society. Now, my own view about this is I think Mill tends to be dismissed a lot. These views of Mill's dismissed a lot at the moment, particularly in the light of the terrorist attack in Christchurch, where people were just saying, you know, we should just outlaw all kinds of racist speech and just chuck people in prison and so on. Basically, if you were to exaggerate this, you might say, if you don't hold standard left-wing views about society, then you should be punished. And Mill's response to this is to say, not only is that unjust, it's also short-sighted, because actually having discussions about this as a community will lead to the society as a whole improving. And I think there's much more to be said for Mill's view than he's generally given credit for today. Okay, so Mill was worried about this kind of conformity, but he wasn't only worried about social conformity, he was also worried about legal conformity, or that is the government actually acting to enforce its norms, coercion. And so what he did was he came up with a principle that was designed to govern not only government behaviour, but the way that anybody behaves with respect to other people. A restriction on our ability to interfere with other people's lives. And that principle is known as the harm principle, and that's where we'll begin our next episode.